"Pack your things, I need a wife, and you need a husband." The rancher said to the native widow Eliza had never imagined that silence could feel so heavy. After her husband passed away unexpectedly, the small wooden house on the edge of the prairie seemed much larger than before. Every corner reminded her of him. His boots still rested near the door. His tools still hung neatly on the wall. Even the wind that passed through the field sounded different now, as if it carried a hollow echo. She did not allow herself much time to grieve. There was too much to do. The land her husband had left behind was small but demanding. The crops needed tending. The chickens needed feeding. The fence along the north side had started to lean. And most important of all, her young son, Caleb, needed her strength more than ever. Eliza woke before sunrise each day. She tied her dark hair back with a simple cloth and stepped outside while the sky was still painted in soft shades of blue and gray. The air was cool and often sharp against her skin, but she welcomed it. It reminded her she was still standing, still moving, still fighting. The townspeople watched her from a distance. Some admired her courage. Others whispered that a woman alone could not survive long on her own land. A few offered small kindnesses, a sack of flour, an extra blanket before winter, but no one offered true partnership. And Eliza never asked. She carried herself with quiet pride. She did not complain. When her hands blistered from repairing the fence, she wrapped them in cloth and kept working. When the crops yielded less than expected, she stretched every meal carefully so Caleb would never feel hunger. Caleb, only 8 years old, had grown quieter since his father's passing. He tried to help in ways that were bigger than his years. He gathered eggs carefully in a small basket. He brought water from the well without spilling it. Sometimes Eliza would catch him watching her with worried eyes, as if he was trying to measure whether she was strong enough for both of them. At night after supper, they would sit near the small fireplace. Eliza would mend clothes while Caleb traced shapes in the dirt floor with a stick. The house was quiet but not empty. They had each other, and that had to be enough. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold and orange, Eliza heard the distant sound of hooves against the dry earth. It was not unusual for riders to pass by, but few ever stopped at her home. The sound grew louder. Caleb looked up from the wooden toy he had carved. "Mama," he said softly, "someone's coming." Eliza stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. In the fading light, she saw a tall man on a dark horse approaching slowly. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable. Even from a distance, she recognized him. Thomas Whitaker. Everyone in town knew his name. He owned the largest ranch in the county, stretching across rolling hills beyond the river. He had once been known as a man who rarely smiled but always kept his word. After his own wife passed away 2 years earlier, he had become even more reserved. He lived with his 2 daughters in a large ranch house that many described as impressive but lonely. Thomas guided his horse to a stop near her fence. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved gently through the tall grass between them. Eliza straightened her shoulders. "Good evening," she said calmly. "Evening," he replied, his voice deep and steady. He removed his hat out of courtesy but did not dismount right away. His eyes moved briefly across her property, the worn fence, the small barn, the narrow field that struggled to produce enough grain. "I won't waste your time," he said after a pause. Eliza felt a flicker of irritation at his directness, but she remained composed. "Then say what you came to say." Thomas finally stepped down from his horse. His boots touched the ground with a firm thud. He walked closer, stopping a few feet away from her. "I need a wife," he said plainly, "and you need a husband." The words hung in the air like a sudden clap of thunder. Eliza blinked once, certain she had misunderstood, but his face showed no sign of humor. "Pack your things," he continued. "Come to my ranch. Bring your boy. We'll marry before winter." There was no softness in his tone. No warmth. It sounded less like a proposal and more like a business agreement. For a moment, Eliza felt heat rise to her face, not from embarrassment but from anger. "Is that how you ask a woman to marry you?" she asked quietly. Thomas did not flinch. "I'm not asking for romance," he replied. "You need security, I need help. My daughters need a woman in that house. Winter's coming, you won't manage alone." His words were blunt but not cruel. He was stating facts as he saw them. Eliza crossed her arms. "And what makes you think I can't manage?" He looked at her hands, rough, worn, marked by hard labor. "You're strong," he admitted. "But strength doesn't change the weather, or the price of feed, or the way this town looks at a widow alone." The truth in his words stung more than she expected. Caleb had stepped quietly onto the porch behind her, listening. Thomas noticed him and nodded once in acknowledgement. "I can offer you land," Thomas continued. "Food, protection, a proper home for your boy. In return, I expect partnership, work, respect." Eliza searched his face for any hint of kindness beyond practicality. She found none, but she did see exhaustion. Deep lines marked his forehead. His eyes, though steady, carried the weight of responsibility. "And love?" she asked softly. Thomas hesitated. It was the first time his confidence wavered. "Love," he said slowly, "isn't something I can promise, but I can promise fairness." The wind blew again, lifting the edge of Eliza's skirt. She felt as if the ground beneath her had shifted. This was not how she had imagined remarriage, if she had imagined it at all. "I won't be anyone's convenience," she said firmly. "You won't be," Thomas replied. "You'll be my wife, my equal in that house." She studied him carefully. There was no mockery in his voice, no hidden threat, only certainty, but certainty was not enough. "I'll give you 3 days," he said finally. "Think about it." Without another word, he placed his hat back on his head, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a storm of thoughts. Eliza stood frozen long after he disappeared from sight. Caleb stepped closer and slipped his small hand into hers. "Mama," he whispered, "are we leaving?" She looked down at him, seeing both fear and hope in his young face. "I don't know," she answered honestly. That night sleep did not come easily. Eliza lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling. Thomas's words echoed in her mind. Security. Winter, protection. She hated that part of her understood his reasoning. She walked quietly to the window and looked out at her land under the pale moonlight. This land held memories. It held her husband's dreams. It held her pride. But it also held risk. For the first time since her husband's passing, Eliza allowed herself to consider a future she had not planned. A future that might mean surrendering some independence in exchange for stability. Yet one question remained heavy in her heart. Was she choosing survival, or was she giving up? As the wind whispered across the prairie once more, Eliza realized that whatever decision she made would change not only her life, but her son's as well. And for a mother, that choice was never simple. The next morning, Eliza woke up earlier than usual. She had barely slept. Thomas Whitaker's words kept repeating in her mind, steady and firm, like the sound of hooves on dry land. She moved quietly so she would not wake Caleb, but she knew he was already awake. Children could sense when something important was hanging in the air. She stepped outside with a bucket in her hand and looked across her small field. The crops were thin. The soil looked tired. The sky was pale and clear, but the air carried a cold warning. Winter was not far away. For the first time, she did not feel only pride when she looked at her land. She felt doubt. Later that morning, she walked into town to trade eggs for flour. As she stepped into the small general store, conversation softened. People did not stop speaking completely, but their voices changed. News traveled fast in small places. Thomas's visit had not gone unnoticed. Mrs. Harper, the store owner, gave her a careful look. "You've had a visitor," she said gently while weighing the flour. Eliza kept her voice calm. "It seems the whole town knows," Mrs. Harper sighed. "Thomas is a serious man, not unkind, just direct." "That's one word for it," Eliza replied quietly. On her way home, she noticed two women standing near the well. They pretended not to stare, but she felt their eyes follow her. Some people would think she was lucky. Others would think she was desperate. A few might believe she was making a mistake no matter what she chose. By the afternoon, the weight of the decision pressed harder on her shoulders than any physical labor ever had. Meanwhile, across the wide stretch of prairie, Thomas Whitaker was facing his own struggles. His ranch was large, but large meant demanding. Fences needed constant repair. Livestock required daily care. The harvest had been average, not strong. Two ranch hands had left the previous month, saying they found better wages in a nearby town. Thomas could not blame them. Times were changing. Inside his big ranch house, the silence felt different from Eliza's home. It was not quiet in a peaceful way. It was empty. His daughters, Anna and Ruth, sat at the kitchen table that afternoon, arguing softly over a school book. Anna, the older one, tried to act mature, but she often looked overwhelmed. Ruth, younger and sensitive, missed her mother deeply, though she rarely spoke about it. Thomas stood by the window, watching the workers in the distance. He had always believed he could manage everything on his own. He had land, he had strength, he had discipline, but raising two daughters while running a ranch was more than physical labor. It required patience, warmth, and guidance, things he was still learning to give. He did not regret riding to Eliza's home. He only regretted how blunt he had sounded. Words had never been his strength. That evening, as the sun dipped low again, Eliza sat across from Caleb at their small wooden table. A simple meal rested between them. "Mama," Caleb said carefully, "will we have to leave Papa's house?" His question was soft, but it carried deep meaning. Eliza reached for his hand. "Nothing is decided yet." "Is Mr. Whitaker kind?" he asked. She paused. It was a simple question with a complicated answer. "I think he tries to be fair," she said finally. Caleb nodded slowly. "Would I have to call him father?" The question caught her by surprise. She saw the fear in his eyes, not of change, but of losing something that belonged to his real father. "No," she said firmly. "No one replaces your father." That night, after Caleb went to bed, Eliza lit a small oil lamp and sat by the window. She began listing things in her mind. If she stayed. If she left. A sharp wind swept across the fields, bending the tall grass low. Eliza spent the day repairing a loose section of fence. As she worked, her hands trembled not from weakness but from the cold. She imagined the coming months. Snow covering the land, supplies running short. The barn growing colder each night. Thomas had not been wrong about one thing. Winter did not care about pride. On the third day, just before sunset, the sound of hooves returned. Caleb ran to the window. "He's here." Eliza took a slow breath and stepped outside again. Thomas dismounted this time without hesitation. He did not waste time with small talk, but his expression was less hard than before. "I said I'd give you 3 days," he began. "You did," she replied. He looked at her home once more, then back at her. "I meant what I said. I can offer stability. Your boy would have schooling. You'd have help with work. My daughters would have guidance." "And what would you expect in return?" she asked. "Commitment," he answered. "Work beside me, help raise the children, share decisions about the household." She studied him carefully. "And if we disagree?" A faint hint of respect crossed his face. "Then we discuss it." That answer surprised her. For a moment neither spoke. The wind moved between them again, but it felt less sharp this time. "I won't move into your house as a servant," Eliza said firmly. "If I come as a partner." Thomas nodded once. "Agreed." She hesitated. "And my son's future will matter as much as your daughter's." "It will," he said without pause. Eliza searched his eyes one last time, looking for doubt or dishonesty. She found neither. What she found instead was tired honesty. Inside her chest, fear and hope battled quietly. She thought about Caleb's thin blanket during winter nights. She thought about Anna and Ruth growing up without guidance. She thought about two broken households that might somehow support each other. Finally, she spoke. "I will come," she said. The words felt both heavy and freeing at the same time. Thomas did not smile widely, but relief softened his features. "We'll marry before the first snow," he said. "This is not a rescue," she added quickly. "This is an agreement." "Yes," he replied. "An agreement." Caleb stepped outside, standing close to his mother. Thomas looked down at him. "You'll have work to do on the ranch," Thomas said calmly. Caleb straightened his small shoulders. "I can work." Thomas gave a short nod. "Good." As Thomas mounted his horse once more, he turned back briefly. "We'll send a wagon in 2 days to help you move." Eliza watched him ride away again, but this time the dust he left behind did not feel like a storm. It felt like the beginning of something uncertain but possible. That night, she walked slowly through her house. She touched the wooden table her husband had built. She traced her fingers along the doorway where Caleb's height had been marked each year. Tears filled her eyes, but she did not let them fall for long. "This is not goodbye," she whispered softly to the empty room. "This is survival." When she finally lay down to rest, her heart still carried worry. But beneath the worry was a small thread of determination. She was not leaving because she was weak. She was choosing a future. The morning Eliza left her small house, the sky was pale and quiet. A thin layer of frost covered the grass, shining softly under the early light. The wagon Thomas had promised arrived just after sunrise. Two ranch hands stepped down politely and began loading her few wooden trunks, a small rocking chair, and the simple kitchen tools she refused to leave behind. Eliza stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping out for the last time. Caleb held her hand tightly. He tried to act brave, but his eyes kept moving around the yard as if he were memorizing every detail: the old fence, the leaning barn, the patch of wildflowers near the well. "Are we coming back?" he asked quietly. Eliza squeezed his hand. "Life moves forward," she said softly. "We carry memories with us." She locked the door, not knowing if she would ever unlock it again. The ride to the Whitaker Ranch felt longer than usual. The prairie stretched wide and open, golden fields rolling toward distant hills. Caleb sat close beside her in the wagon, silent for most of the journey. Eliza kept her back straight, her thoughts steady. She had chosen this path. Now she would walk it with dignity. When the ranch house finally came into view, it looked larger than she remembered. The two-story wooden home stood strong against the open sky, with wide windows and a long porch stretching across the front. Smoke rose gently from the chimney, promising warmth inside. Thomas stood waiting near the steps when the wagon stopped. His daughters stood a few feet behind him. Anna, the older girl, had her arms crossed. She studied Eliza carefully, her expression guarded. Ruth, smaller and quieter, stayed half-hidden behind her sister, peeking out with curious eyes. Thomas stepped forward. "Welcome," he said simply. Eliza nodded politely. "Thank you." There was no celebration, no grand greeting, just a quiet understanding that life was changing for all of them. Inside the house, everything felt unfamiliar to Eliza. The ceilings were higher than she was used to. The floors creaked differently. The kitchen was larger, with shelves neatly arranged but lacking the gentle touch of a woman's daily care. Anna watched closely as Eliza set down her belongings. "Are you going to move Mother's things?" Anna asked suddenly. The question was sharp but not rude. It carried fear. Eliza looked at her carefully. "No," she said calmly. "Your mother's place here stays as it is." Anna seemed surprised by the answer. She gave a small nod but said nothing more. The first evening under one roof felt tense. Supper was simple. Eliza offered to cook, but Thomas insisted she rest after the journey. Anna prepared the meal instead, though she moved stiffly around the kitchen. They sat at the long wooden table. Caleb kept his eyes on his plate. Ruth glanced between everyone as if trying to understand the new arrangement. Thomas cleared his throat. "From now on," he said, "we work together." It sounded more like a ranch rule than a family promise, but it was a beginning. The days that followed were filled with adjustment. Eliza woke early, as she always had. She found her way around the kitchen quietly at first, careful not to disturb the routines that already existed. She did not try to take control immediately. Instead, she observed. She noticed that the pantry needed better organization. Some supplies were nearly empty while others were forgotten at the back of shelves. She began arranging things slowly, thoughtfully, never removing anything important without asking. Anna watched this with quiet attention. Outside, Caleb followed Thomas across the wide fields. The ranch felt enormous compared to his old home. There were more animals, more workers, more responsibility. At first, he struggled to keep up, but Thomas did not mock him or dismiss him. He gave clear instructions and steady guidance. "Hold the rope firm," Thomas would say. "Stand steady. Let the animal feel your calm." Caleb listened carefully, determined to prove himself. Inside the house, small misunderstandings began to surface. One afternoon, Ruth accidentally spilled a bucket of water across the kitchen floor. She froze, expecting scolding. Before she could react, Eliza knelt down with a cloth. "It's only water," Eliza said gently. "We clean and move on." Ruth blinked in surprise. "You're not angry?" "No," Eliza replied. "Mistakes are part of learning." Anna observed from the doorway, her guarded expression softening just slightly. Still, tension lingered in quiet ways. At bedtime, Ruth whispered to Anna, "Do you think she's going to make us forget Mama?" Anna shook her head. "No one can do that," she said firmly, though part of her was still unsure. Meanwhile, Eliza faced her own doubts. At night, when the house grew silent, she sometimes felt like a guest rather than a wife. Thomas remained respectful but distant. Their conversations focused on work schedules, supplies, and plans for winter. They shared a room, but emotional space remained between them. One evening, as Eliza folded laundry near the fireplace, Thomas paused beside her. "You've made the house run smoother," he said quietly. She looked up, surprised by the comment. "It only needed small changes," he nodded. "The girls seem calmer." "That takes time," she replied. He hesitated before adding, "I appreciate it." It was not a grand statement, but it was sincere. Gradually, laughter began to return to the house. Caleb and Ruth discovered they both enjoyed caring for the chickens. They would race each other to gather eggs in the morning. Anna began asking Eliza questions about cooking techniques. At first, the questions were practical. Later, they became more personal. "How did you learn to bake like this?" Anna asked one afternoon. "My mother taught me," Eliza answered. "She believed food carries comfort." Anna was quiet for a moment. "Mother used to say something like that." Eliza smiled gently. Then she was wise. The words built a small bridge between them. Outside, the ranch work grew steadier. With Eliza managing the household efficiently, Thomas found more time to focus on larger decisions. He began consulting her about supply purchases and winter preparations. "What do you think?" he asked one evening, spreading out numbers across the table. Eliza studied the figures carefully. "If we reduce spending on extra feed now and store more grain, we'll be safer when snow comes." Thomas listened, truly listened, and nodded. "We'll do that." The children noticed the shift as well. Their conversations at supper grew less formal. Stories were shared. Caleb described a calf that refused to cooperate. Ruth laughed for the first time in days. Still, not everything was perfect. One afternoon, Anna confronted Eliza in the hallway. "Are you trying to replace her?" she asked directly. Eliza met her gaze calmly. "No," she said. "Your mother had her place, I have mine. They are not the same." Anna searched her face for signs of dishonesty. She found none. "Then what are you here for?" Anna asked. "To build something new," Eliza replied softly. "Not to erase what was." That answer lingered in Anna's mind long after the conversation ended. Weeks passed, and the house slowly began to feel warmer, not just from the fireplace, but from shared routines and growing understanding. Thomas noticed the change most of all. He saw how Caleb stood taller each day. He saw how Anna no longer kept her arms crossed at the table. He saw Ruth slipping her small hand into Eliza's when crossing the yard. One evening, as the sun painted the horizon in soft orange light, Thomas and Eliza stood side by side on the porch. "The ranch feels different," he said quietly. "Different can be good," she replied. He glanced at her. "I wasn't certain this would work." "Neither was I," she admitted. A faint smile touched his face, small but real. Inside the house, the children's laughter floated through the open door. It was not a perfect family yet. There were still quiet fears and unspoken worries, but something steady was forming beneath it all. Respect, trust, a sense that perhaps this arrangement was becoming more than survival. As the first cold winds of winter brushed across the prairie, the Whitaker Ranch stood stronger, not only because of fences repaired or grain stored carefully, but because 5 lives were slowly learning how to move forward together. And though the beginning had been built on necessity, something deeper was quietly taking root under that wide open sky. The first snow came quietly, covering the wide fields in soft white. At first, it looked peaceful, almost beautiful. The children ran to the windows in excitement. Caleb pressed his hands against the glass. Ruth laughed as snowflakes swirled through the air. Even Anna allowed herself a small smile. But Thomas did not smile. He stood on the porch studying the sky. The clouds were thick and heavy. The wind carried a sharp warning. This was not a gentle winter. It was going to test them. Within days, the temperature dropped further. Snow piled high against the fences. The animals grew restless in the barns. Water buckets froze overnight. Every task became twice as difficult. Eliza woke before sunrise as usual, wrapping herself in layers before stepping outside. The cold bit at her cheeks, but she did not complain. She joined Thomas in checking the livestock, her boots sinking deep into snow with each step. The ranch hands worked hard, but even they looked worried. If the storm continued, supplies would run thin. Travel to town would become impossible. One evening, the wind began to howl fiercely. It pushed against the house walls and rattled the windows. Snow fell heavily, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Thomas closed the shutters tightly. "This one's strong," he said quietly. The children gathered near the fireplace. Caleb tried to act brave, but his eyes revealed concern. Ruth held tightly to Anna's arm. The storm lasted 2 full days. When it finally calmed, the damage was clear. Several sections of fence had collapsed under the weight of snow. 2 calves had wandered too far and needed to be found quickly. The barn roof had lost shingles. One storage shed door had broken loose. Thomas stood in the yard, hands on his hips, taking in the scene. His jaw tightened. "It'll take weeks to fix," one ranch hand muttered. "And money," another added quietly. Money. The word carried weight. They had prepared carefully for winter, but repairs like this would strain even their cautious planning. Eliza stepped beside Thomas. "We'll handle it," she said steadily. He glanced at her. "It's not that simple." "No," she agreed. "But worrying won't repair fences." There was no criticism in her tone, only determination. The next days were filled with hard work. Thomas and the ranch hands focused on rebuilding the broken fences. Caleb followed them, carrying tools and doing small tasks with serious concentration. Inside the house, Eliza organized supplies carefully. She adjusted meal portions so nothing would be wasted. She sent Anna and Ruth to gather firewood from the safer areas near the house. Despite their efforts, tension began to grow. One afternoon, Thomas returned inside, snow clinging to his coat. He looked exhausted. "We lost one of the calves," he said quietly. The words hung in the air. Caleb lowered his head. Ruth looked confused. Anna pressed her lips together. Eliza placed a steady hand on the table. "We still have the rest," she said gently. "We focus on what we can protect." Thomas ran a hand through his hair. You don't understand. Every loss matters. Her voice remained calm. I do understand, but if you let frustration take over, the rest will suffer too. He looked at her sharply at first, but then his expression softened. He knew she was right. That night, after the children were asleep, Thomas sat heavily in a chair near the fire. I thought I had everything under control, he admitted quietly. Eliza sat across from him. No one controls the weather. It's not just the storm, he continued. Feed prices are rising. Repairs cost more than expected. I asked you to come here for stability. Instead, you walked into hardship. She looked at him steadily. Hardship is not new to me. He held her gaze for a long moment. For the first time, his strong exterior seemed to crack slightly. I don't want to fail them, he said, his voice lower than usual. The children, you. You won't, she replied. Not if we stand together. The next challenge came unexpectedly. A sickness spread among a few animals in one section of the barn. It was not severe, but it required careful attention. Thomas worried about the cost of medicine. He calculated numbers late into the night. Eliza noticed how he carried the weight alone. The following morning, she approached him with an idea. We can sell some of the extra woven blankets I brought from my old home, she suggested, and I can take on mending work for neighbors once the road's clear. Thomas frowned slightly. You shouldn't have to. This is my home too, she interrupted gently. Your burdens are mine. The words settled deeply. He studied her face and realized something important. She was not there out of obligation anymore. She was invested. She cared about the ranch, about the children, about the future. That realization changed something inside him. Over the next weeks, they worked more closely than ever. Decisions were made together. Plans were adjusted together. One afternoon, as they repaired part of the fence side by side, Thomas paused. You were right about storing extra grain, he said. She smiled faintly. I'm glad we did. I should have listened more often before, he admitted. She looked at him with mild surprise. You're listening now. Snow still covered much of the land, but small signs of strength appeared. The children adapted in their own ways. Caleb grew more confident, helping care for the recovering animals. Anna began organizing indoor chores without being asked. Ruth started reading aloud by the fire in the evenings, her voice bringing warmth into the room. The house, once tense and uncertain, now felt united in effort. One evening, as the wind outside softened and the sky cleared for the first time in weeks, Thomas and Eliza stood in the barn doorway. The animals were calm. The repairs were nearly complete. The worst seemed to have passed. You didn't run, Thomas said quietly. She looked at him. Why would I? Many would have, he replied. This life is not easy. She considered his words carefully. I did not come here for ease. I came for partnership. The word lingered between them. For the first time, Thomas reached for her hand, not out of need, not out of obligation, but out of gratitude. His grip was warm despite the cold air. I'm grateful, he said simply. Eliza felt something shift inside her. What had begun as a practical arrangement was now built on shared struggle and mutual respect. They had faced a storm, both outside and within themselves, and they had not fallen apart. Instead, they had grown steadier. As spring slowly began to hint at its arrival, small patches of earth peeked through the melting snow. The land looked worn but alive. And so did they. The trials had tested more than fences and barns. They had tested trust, patience, and commitment. What remained was stronger than before, not because life had become easy, but because they had chosen again and again to face it side by side. The snow melted into clear streams that ran through the fields. The frozen ground softened, ready for new seeds. The air no longer carried the sharp bite of winter. Instead, it felt fresh, full of quiet promise. The Whitaker ranch looked worn from the storm, but it was still standing strong. The fences had been repaired. The barn roof was fixed. The animals had recovered. What once felt like loss now felt like survival. Inside the house, something had changed too. The long dining table that once felt too big for 5 uncertain people now felt just right. Supper was no longer quiet and careful. It was filled with stories from the day. Caleb spoke proudly about helping train a young colt. Anna shared plans for planting a small vegetable garden near the house. Ruth often read short passages from her schoolbook, her voice bright and confident. And Eliza listened with a calm smile, feeling something she had not felt in a long time: belonging. Thomas noticed it too. He noticed how Caleb no longer hesitated before speaking. He noticed how Anna asked Eliza for advice without tension in her voice. He noticed how Ruth reached for Eliza's hand without thinking. The house no longer felt divided between past and present. It felt united. One evening, as the sun lowered gently over the fields, Thomas stood outside watching the workers prepare the soil for planting. The sky was painted in soft gold and pink. He thought about the past year, the proposal, the doubts, the storm, the repairs. He had asked Eliza to marry him because he needed help, but somewhere along the way, that reason had changed. Eliza stepped onto the porch beside him, wiping her hands on her apron after finishing the evening meal. She followed his gaze toward the horizon. "It's going to be a good season," she said quietly. "Yes," he replied, "I believe it will." For a moment they stood in comfortable silence. Then Thomas spoke, his voice steady but softer than usual. "When I first rode to your house," he began, "I thought I was offering you something." Eliza glanced at him, curious. "I thought I was giving you security," he continued. "Land, protection, stability." She waited for him to finish. "But the truth is," he said slowly, "you gave this ranch more than I expected. You brought balance. You brought warmth back into this house." Eliza felt her chest tighten slightly at his words. "I didn't come to change everything," she replied gently. "I only wanted us to survive." "We've done more than survive," Thomas said. "We've built something." The wind moved softly through the tall grass around them. It no longer sounded lonely. It sounded peaceful. Inside, laughter echoed through the open window. Caleb and Ruth were arguing playfully over whose turn it was to wash dishes. Anna's voice rose above theirs, trying to restore order but failing as she began laughing too. Thomas looked toward the sound, then back at Eliza. "I never promised love," he said quietly. "I didn't think I could." Eliza remembered those words clearly. They had once felt like a warning. "But somewhere along the way," he continued, "respect turned into something deeper. I don't need a wife for this ranch anymore. I want you as my partner, not because it's practical, but because it feels right." The honesty in his voice was not dramatic. It was steady, real. Eliza felt tears gather in her eyes, but she did not let them fall easily. She had built strong walls around her heart after losing her first husband. She had promised herself she would never depend completely on someone again. Yet this was different. Thomas was not asking her to give up herself. He was asking her to stand beside him by choice. "I never expected this either," she admitted softly. "When I agreed to come here, I was thinking only of Caleb's future." "And now?" he asked. She looked toward the house where their children's voices blended together without division. "Now I see more than survival," she said. "I see a family." Thomas reached for her hand again, but this time there was no hesitation. His grip was warm, certain. "We've both known loss," he said, "but loss doesn't have to define the rest of our lives." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." Over the next weeks, the ranch seemed to flourish along with their growing bond. Seeds were planted in neat rows across the fields. Anna's small vegetable garden began to sprout green shoots. Caleb worked harder than ever, eager to prove himself. Ruth often sat beside Eliza in the evenings, asking about stories from her childhood. One afternoon, Ruth asked a simple question. "Can I call you Mama?" The room grew still. Eliza looked at the young girl carefully. There was no pressure in her eyes, only hope. "You may call me whatever feels comfortable in your heart," Eliza replied gently. Ruth smiled shyly. "Mama," she repeated softly. Anna watched from across the table. After a brief pause, she spoke as well. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not trying to replace her. And for being here." Eliza walked over and placed a gentle hand on Anna's shoulder. "There is room in this house for many kinds of love," she said. That evening, as the family gathered outside to watch the sunset, something felt complete. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, no longer threatening or uncertain. It felt like home. Thomas wrapped an arm around Eliza's shoulders, a simple gesture but meaningful. She leaned into him naturally. The children sat nearby, talking and laughing without thinking about the past divisions that once existed. What had started as a practical arrangement had slowly become something steady and strong. There had been no grand declarations at the beginning, no promises of romance, only need. But through shared work, shared hardship, and quiet understanding, that need had transformed. Eliza no longer felt like a guest in the house. Thomas no longer felt like he was carrying the ranch alone. And the children no longer felt like two separate families forced together. They were one. As the final light of the day faded, Thomas spoke softly. "Thank you for staying." Eliza smiled. "Thank you for asking." The wind moved gently across the land, carrying with it the scent of fresh soil and new beginnings. What began with blunt words spoken at a lonely doorstep had turned into a partnership built on trust, patience, and choice. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady.